mass casualty incidents and triage. I'm Tracy Gaunt, Professional Standards Specialist with the Southwest Ontario Regional Base Hospital Program, along with my colleague here, Dr. Don Eby, who's joining us. He's the local medical director up here in Grey County, and this is where we are right now. It's a little different for us this morning with this webinar in that we're also doing a live rounds. So welcome everyone here this morning up in the Owen Sound area. We're going to go through the presentation. As we go through the presentation, I'm going to pause in certain areas to allow questions. So if you could hold off your questions until we get to those areas, that would be greatly appreciated. So once again, welcome to the rounds. We're going to go through the objectives of the MCI and triage, a brief introduction. I'm going to present a case that occurred up in this area. We're going to talk about mass casualty triage, the tag system, the medical directives, and do a summary, and then open it up to more questions and answers. So at the end of this presentation, the paramedic will be able to describe the basic principles of mass casualty triage, relate the actions required to optimize care for the maximum number of salvageable patients, modify your plan of action to address all patients once additional resources have arrived, and integrate the general traumatic arrest protocol into standard MCI principles and practice. Triage is a system that's utilized at mass casualty incidents for sorting or categorizing patients based on the severity of their injuries and need for critical intervention relative to the available resources. There's a recent case up in this area of mass casualty incident which resulted in discussion among the crews regarding the triage tag system and also a different interpretation of which medical directive should be applied. I'm going to go through a brief summary of the case, and then we're going to open it up just for discussions before Dr. Don Eby takes over and continues with the presentation. The crew is dispatch code 4 for a multi-vehicle collision with several critical patients. The supervisor that was working that day arrived on scene approximately 5 minutes after the first crew. The incident occurred outside of the city limits, so the second unit available was about 15 minutes out. When the first crew got there, they performed triage and discovered 2 VSA patients on scene, along with 1 critical patient and another patient deemed later to have some minor injuries. When they did the triage, they realized that the VSA patients did not meet obvious death criteria, so the crew attended to the critical patient first. As they were attending to the critical patient, that patient went VSA in front of them. The supervisor arrived shortly after they did, so the supervisor assisted the crew with the resuscitation efforts of the critical patient that went VSA and prepared that patient for packaging and transport. That patient was in the back of the vehicle. When the second crew arrived, that first crew left with that patient who had now gone VSA and transported to the hospital. The second crew arrived, the supervisor was still on scene, and they went over to the VSA patients. The supervisor began to patch to the base hospital physician for termination of resuscitation on both the VSA patients, just as that second crew arrived. No attempts at resuscitation had been attempted on either of the VSA patients prior to that second crew arriving or while that crew was there. A tour was granted for both the patients, and they were left with the police on scene. Before we go into the philosophy of mass casualty triage, do we have any questions about the case study that I did not kind of highlight? All right, there's no question, so I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Eby. Oh, okay, there is a question.
So no question about this? Okay. It's Don Eby. The issue that came up out of this case was what do we do with the 2 VSA patients? And in this particular, this is really, I think, the nub of the rounds right now, is how were the VSA patients handled once the second crew arrived or once more resources arrived. And it really goes to the heart of what the philosophy of mass casualty triage is all about. Mass casualty triage actually can be simplified. It can be either very simple or can be increasingly complicated as you go into various systems for it. But essentially, the situation that you have is that you have a mass casualty incident anytime the number of casualties that you have overwhelms the available resources needed to treat everyone who needs treatment. So, I mean, this could happen. A mass casualty incident could be 2 people, potentially. Could be 3 people. Could be 100 people. But the principles are really all the same, and the situation arises whenever what you need to do, you're not able to do for everyone at initially. So the issue then becomes, how do you organize the resources available to you to provide the greatest good to the greatest number of people? And this is really, the philosophic principle behind this is utilitarianism, which is essentially that it's okay to not do something for one person. Do you spend all your resources on one person to benefit one person when everyone else could use some of the resources, or do you spread your resources to give a little bit of something to everyone, but ignoring the person who might use up all your resources? So that's really it. And if we move on, this then becomes the real dilemma, because as emergency personnel, we tend to put our focus and our efforts into who is the most critically injured. But the problem here is that if you put all your resources into someone who's likely to die, you're basically wasting your resources when other people can benefit from them. Oops, sorry, we're going backwards here. Okay, so in a normal situation, in most of your calls, we're generally treating only one person or at most 2, and generally speaking, it really doesn't matter which one you treat first. So you generally will treat the most injured person first and the least injured last. Okay. Now, as I say, the real problem here is that you may still have someone who's alive, but in the grand scheme of things, they're not likely going to survive their injuries. So in this particular case, there were 2 people who were VSA. There's not much you can do about them. The question then becomes, do you start the traumatic arrest protocol on these 2 patients who are VSA, or do you deal with the person who is having difficulty breathing? And so as the first crew on, you potentially could waste a lot of time getting the tour for the 2 who were VSA, while the person who was still breathing, there may have been something to do for them. Or as the case progressed, once the paramedics got the 3rd person out of the car and that person goes VSA, we still have another injured person. Do they spend their resources working on the person who's just become VSA right in front of them, or do you put your efforts and your resources into the person who's still alive? And so really, this is the dilemma. And so we have to have a system that allows us to triage people. Because really what you ultimately want to do is you want to use the resources that you have available that potentially would save people's lives. Okay, and so to do this, there is a rapid, simple triage and rapid treatment system that's been developed. This particular system with the green, yellow, red, and black tag, which I believe everyone is using, was originally developed in California, And there's a whole series of systems that have been developed. This is actually a very simple system that allows you to triage people, and I think everybody's familiar with it. So the basic principle here is that green tags are minor. They're people that can be cared, their care can be delayed for greater than an hour, the so-called walking wounded. The yellow tag are the ones who you potentially can delay urgent care. Something like that would be someone with a fracture, for example, say an open fracture of a leg, somebody who would have a burn, for example, maybe a 10% body burn might fit into that category. The red tags are the immediate care or the life-threatening care, someone who's short of breath, someone who is not responding from a head injury, and black tags are VSAs or people who are likely to become VSAs soon. And as I say, the black tags are the ones that are the most problematic because they're the ones who are either VSA or they're still alive. In this particular case that we were discussing, the person who they're taking out of the vehicle who has agonal breathing or a major injury. And in this particular case, they were approximately 10 to 15 minutes from hospital. And the thing to keep in mind is that once someone becomes VSA from trauma, they rarely, if ever, survive in our system. Or the ones who are almost on the way to becoming VSA or that you expect to be VSA in the next even 10 or 20 minutes are not going to survive in this system. So some of these are straightforward. Some of them, however, aren't straightforward. Dr. Llewellyn and I were discussing an example might be someone who was involved in an explosion and had a burn. So someone with a burn over 90% of their body, are they going to survive or not? Possibly not, probably not in all likelihood. A 90% body surface area burn in an adult, that's not a survivable or usually a survivable injury. So although it's tempting to treat that person who's sitting there talking to you, you know that they're not likely going to survive. And so this person would be considered the lower priority, or you would black tag that person. The issue then becomes, the VSAs are again, fairly straightforward, or the obviously dead are straightforward. But we have in our system, we have the VSA who's not obviously dead. And this really presents the big problem. So how do you apply the medical directives correctly? Almost all mass casualty incidents will be traumatic, but there could also be medical causes. So suppose, for example, there's a poisoning, or you're called to a fair, and all of a sudden you've got people who are losing consciousness from having eaten something. So, I mean, that would be an example of a potential mass casualty incident that isn't traumatic. How about, carbon monoxide poisoning? There was a case in this area a couple years ago where several people were exposed to carbon monoxide. And, some of them died, some of them were just poisoned by it. How do you deal with those people? So you have to keep in mind which medical directive to use and which would be appropriate. And so you have to use the appropriate one, and this could be either the blunt VSA, the penetrating trauma VSA, or a medical VSA. And unless the person is obviously dead, they're just VSA. Okay, now that's a kind of a distinction here, and this is really what was the point of this rounds, or for having this rounds, is what should the crews and the supervisor have done with the two people that they decided were VSA when they first arrived. And again, the issue with mass casualty triage is that it's a dynamic state. So when there's only 2 of you arrive first, there's only 2 paramedics to deal with potentially a number of casualties. As more paramedics arrive on the scene, or as fire arrives on the scene, you begin to have more resources, and so you have to change what you're thinking. So rather than get stuck on a particular path, a mass casualty incident changes almost minute by minute as resources become available or become used up. And so you have to be able to be flexible with this. So that in the particular case that we're discussing, we have 2 people who they decided were VSA and very appropriately didn't spend any time trying to get a traumatic field pronouncement for. They had a casualty who was critically injured and in fact went VSA just as they were getting him into the ambulance. And so then the question becomes, so quite appropriately when the second crew arrived, the first crew left with the patient that they had loaded, because again what we had left was we had 2 people VSA and one person that would have actually fit into the green or yellow tag situation. So what do you do with the 2 VSA patients? And in the particular case that occurred, the supervisor said, well, we haven't worked on these people now for 20 minutes. They've been VSA. It was unwitnessed. And rather than go and extract the people from the car, put on the pads, and then seek a traumatic VSA, or sorry, traumatic field pronouncement, they just phoned the base hospital doctor and said, well, we've had these 2 people VSA for 20 minutes. Can I have a field pronouncement? And that was given. And then the issue became, what do we do? Was that the right thing to do? And as things happened, that was that generated a fair amount of discussion. So in summary, mass casualty incidents are really all about the resources that are available. If you've got them, you use them, but you use the resources that you have appropriately. It's a dynamic situation that changes as more resources become available or gets used up. It requires judgment, and it's a very high-stress situation because you've got people coming and going, and you've got people potentially dying in front of you. And worse off, you've got people who you would normally deal with that you're in fact ignoring. And that's a very difficult thing for people to do because you're making the judgment that they're not going to live. So I would like to open it up at this time to any questions, either from the audience here or from the audience there.
Hey, good morning, everyone. This is Stephanie Romano here. If anyone does have a question, what you can do on the left-hand side of your control panel is raise your hand if you do have a microphone and you're viewing our webinar from home. If anyone in the room here either has a question or would like to participate, same thing, just put your hand up and we'll actually have you speak live through one of our computers here so that everyone can hear. So if anyone has a question, just feel free to go ahead and put your hand up. And if you don't have a microphone, you can also put your question into the discussion box, and we can read those out as well.
We've got one question online, Don, that maybe you want to take about calling base hospital for unusual circumstances. So I know that's been something that you've talked about. Can you maybe address some of that online?
I guess the question is this a situation where someone could have used the unusual circumstances directive? I think is that what I'm being asked?
Yeah, just how the unusual circumstance would apply in this particular situation.
Yeah, this case generated a fair amount of discussion among the medical directors, and I think the feeling was that this is really the situation is really covered by the traumatic VSA medical directives. So it really, although it's an unusual circumstance, it is something which is covered by a series of directives, and so technically wouldn't be an unusual circumstance.
Any questions from the audience here? It's also difficult to use artificial that we're talking to the computer and you guys are here too. So I mean, I know this all the ground around here.
You go right over.
Hi, it's Mike Llewell here. We're sitting here in Owen Sound, and there's a group of medics here who are also from the same service that manage the call. So we can have some interaction with the medics here. And you guys are the ones that were talking about this call. Is there any sort of fact is our recollection of the call accurate to who were there? Is anyone in the room that were on the scene?
I was third car, yeah.
One of the paramedics is actually on the call to come talk to us through the microphone.
Yes, this is Peter Shaw. I was third car in when we arrived with torrential rain. I also wondered how safe it was. So you'd have to first person out, obviously. You really couldn't work them on the ground. And I wonder if that was a problem.
Sure. So the question is, can you use your defibrillator in the rain? And it's a very difficult situation in that. You ideally want to have them not submerged or in a puddle if you're going to be shocking them, but try and get them out of the area and into some protection area, like the back of your ambulance. But the rain itself is not an indication to not hook them up to the defib. You just have to find a better, safe spot for it in the analysis. Next question, though. No, that was for the VSA patients or the initial patient?
No, the VSA. You were in me from when I got back, so it was quite a relief that there are quite a long response from me.
Yeah.
So by the time we arrived, this decision had already been made, and we were just instructed to hook our defibrillator up to one of the patients, and another crew hooked up to the other one, just to make sure we had a systole.
Yeah.
That's what we did.
You know, the moment we heard about this call, Don and I, and actually a lot of the other medical directors, Dr. Duclos and Dr. Bradford, we've been talking about this call quite a bit, largely because it's not common that we have mass casualty triage. You guys have a lot of training in that, and dating back to 2000 when the training from the ministry came out, and you guys, none of us actually do this on a routine basis. And it's always quite a high-stress situation when you have a mass casualty triage, because normally, as we do every day, we do multiple casualty triage. We go to the sickest person first. And as Don was alluding to, is the moment we switch from that mentality where we do the sickest patient first to we ignore what is our usually sickest patient, the VSA patient, we get something stressed by that, and also it's very difficult to make a decision as to, I'm going to withhold care from this person to be able to provide the care for this other patient over here who has a higher chance of survival. It doesn't mean you go to the ankle sprain, because that person's going to live regardless. You go to the person that will live with field intervention, or more likely to live with field intervention. And it seems that the actions from the paramedics, as we discussed this on this case, was actually the correct ones. But we wanted to explore this, what were actually the rationale behind, the thought process behind it, in case we have another one of these, even on a larger scale. And as Dr. Eby was saying, the larger and larger the scale, the more people you need to triage into black and blue and green into red. And then even amongst your reds, if you have 5 or 10 or 15 reds, then you have to be able to say, who are my reds that are going to more likely live versus these reds, because not every red is together. The most common case that people use for this in my training, in medical training for physicians, is you have 3 people and you have 2 chest tubes. One guy needs 2 chest tubes to live, and 2 people each need a chest tube. So if you use your 2 chest tubes on the one guy so you can save him, then the other 2 people are going to lose their life. So what you do is you say, well, I'm going to use my 2 chest tubes for these 2 people, and the one guy who needs both is out of luck. So it's about making that final analysis of who is going to most likely benefit. And remember that entire process is entirely dynamic, that it changes on a moment basis, because as soon as another crew arrives, well, then you have to reassess who now goes. I now have more resources. I don't have to triage away from people. And that's sort of the philosophy behind this. Very, very difficult case, and we obviously don't like them, but how do we move ahead if we're involved in a similar situation? Because I think the medics acted correctly in this call. Is there any more questions from the audience on this? Thank you, Peter.
Is there anyone from home with a microphone that would like to speak up and ask a question? And if that's the case, just throw your hand up on your control panel and we'll unmute you, and that way you can have a chance to participate.
Definitely on my computer, I see some questions popping up.
Here, Mike, some of these are just popping up on the screen, but maybe you want to talk to this question. Would you not consider the walking wounded in this case as critical, since the mechanism of injury caused 3 VSAs?
So there's all these different triage tools, as Dr. Eva was saying, for the walking wounded. One of the training tools I was taught for the large walking wounded population, it also depends on the size of your disaster scene. If you have hundreds of casualties, or 10 to 20 or 30 casualties, the first technique you use for the walking wounded is to say, anyone who can hear me, wave your hand. And they look at you and they wave their hand. Anyone who can walk, come this way. You bring these people out of the zone and put them in one location. So now you have your walking wounded in one location. In theory, if they understand and can ambulate, by definition, they're your walking wounded. So therefore, they probably aren't critically unwell, at this point at least, because they're able to mentate, ambulate, and move and understand. So then you have the anyone who can hear me, raise your hand but can't move. So you look through your field environment, you see people that are holding their hand up, but they can't move for whatever reason. They have fractured femurs, or they have some sort of debilitating disease. Even those people you ignore, because then you go to the people that aren't lifting their hands and aren't moving, because those people are not able to obey commands, not able to move. So they're either black or they're red. So they're either tremendously hypotensive with a tension pneumothorax and have a neurological injury and can't move, or they're VSA. And so you're going to choose them black and red, and that's how you find your black and reds. And amongst your red, you then figure who goes first. Or who is most likely to die anyway, who's most likely to live anyway, and take the person who's mostly going to live with immediate intervention. Those are the ones you go to. So to answer that question specifically, in the walking wounded, of course, you're always concerned about the mechanism, and amongst those walking wounded, someone has a ruptured spleen, is becoming hypovolemic as you talk to them, but someone potentially is even more sick in the casualty zone, so those you direct your attention to. See another question there, Dave?
Actually, yeah, Mike, I do, for Mike and Don. In the case that the 4th patient was more seriously injured, obviously this patient would be the next person to be treated. At what point would you tend to the field pronouncement of the 2 VSA patients left in the cars? Would you leave this field pronouncement to the very last step?
In this particular situation, that's exactly what I would do. You know, if you truly have walking wounded, those people can stay, and because again, the walking wounded, or the ones that we're calling green tag, you don't really need to, they don't need any specific treatment for more than an hour is the sort of guideline. So in that situation, you would go back to the people that you have black tagged to make sure they truly were black tags. Because occasionally you will have people who might be VSA, but in a PEA, or have a low, potentially a low blood pressure that you're not able to feel, and then when you actually go back and have a better look at them, they may in fact be salvageable with the resources that you now have available. They wouldn't have been a choice that you would have made when there's only 2 of you, but now when the 3rd car comes in, that person would be, it would be more appropriate to go back and reassess those people before you would deal with the person who basically was cuts and scrapes.
Even you go back to the other case too, in amongst your greens, you would probably have, if you're on a normal day, most of your greens are walking wounded, you would lay down, you'd mobilize, you'd package, and you'd bring to the emerge. I mean, that's your typical method of operating with your greens when you're not overwhelmed. But you're not, in this situation, it's very odd because you're taking your walking wound and you're moving them because you're overwhelmed. You say, I can't deal with you right now. You're least alive. There are potentially 3 or 4 dead people over here, or VSA people, or critically injured people. So get out of the danger zone, lie down, sit there, be quiet. I'll be with you when I can. We have additional resources. We're going to focus on the reds and blacks here and find out who we need to go right now. And then, absolutely, as soon as you shift and have more resources, that's when you start packaging and immobilizing those people as you normally would do, because you're no longer in mass casualty triage. You're now in multiple casualty triage, which is what we do every day, similar to what I do and you do in the emergency department. Every day in the emergency department is multiple casualty. We go to the VSAs, and then after that we go to the shortness of breath, then we go to the chest pains, and then work our way down to the sore throats. That's multiple casualty. But if you're in mass casualty, which sometimes it feels like you're in mass casualty sometimes, you'd ignore the VSA, and in mass casualty you never do CPR in mass casualty. As soon as you have multiple casualties, those resources become available, then you attend to the VSAs.
But as Mike was also saying, I mean, we're making this distinction between multiple casualties and mass casualties. But a couple of years ago, Bruce County had a school bus crash where there were something like 20 students required some kind of medical care at the emergency department. But the same principles are used for that. So, you know, the paramedics who first arrived on the scene basically triaged or started to triage the students who, again, none of them were critically injured and none of them died, but you still would deal with the more seriously injured. But you need to have a form of rapid triage with that to decide who should get seen first. And again, to use the resources. So for example, if you needed to put someone on a backboard or a collar, you need to be, and you only had 1 backboard or 2 backboards, who gets it and who does this? And so the principles are really the same, even though you may not be dealing with critically injured people.
And the great opportunity about today is that we don't get to talk about this very often, because thankfully it doesn't happen very often, but it's a ticking time bomb, because you know what happens. Chatham-Kent had the big disaster a few years ago in the 401, and you know, we all live next to potential sources for disaster, both chemical exposures, as you mentioned. Sarnia, Lambton has a huge issue with regard to all the petroleum plants, so therefore petroleum plants. So this is an issue that the more we talk about, the better it is, because we're prepared.
Any other questions online, Dave?
At the moment, I have no typed questions. I don't see anybody's hands up. For those of you who are new to the webinar, if you're watching on the webinar, there's a little button there. It's a little hand. If you click on that, if you want to ask a question, we can actually open your mic and put you on. Also, anybody in the classroom, if you've got any questions, because we are here live as well. We've got about a dozen medics in the area. So if there's any questions in the room for Mike or Don or Tracy.
There was a question that came in that's typed here. Is it, what if one of the 2 VSAs had been under 16? Would that have changed?
Well, the 2 VSAs are under 16, so I would do the exact same triage that the medics on this call did. So I would go to the reds, the shortness of breath person that soon became VSA. I mean, that was the right triage tool. It sounds like the second patient, I wasn't there, but it's my understanding of the case, the second alive patient wasn't extremely critical. There's the 2 other VSAs. So at that point, when more resources arrived, I'd go to the VSAs and hook them up. But you can't patch for TOR in that situation, a trauma TOR, because there's less than 16. Your trauma TOR doesn't apply. So in that situation, you have 2 options, 3 options. Transport, CPR and transport, because now you have resources to do that. You have patch for unusual circumstances, which is what would effectively happen here, which is not inappropriate. And then thirdly, you use the option to, if they have obvious death criteria, then they're obviously dead. So they've, and it's very specific in the BLS manual as to what obvious death criteria are. So they're either pronounced because of obvious death, you have to transport them, or else you can patch for unusual circumstance.
So just to be clear, Mike, you're saying that
Uh-oh.
If you have a pediatric patient who 20 minutes ago you've decided was VSA, and you've spent your time in the last 20 minutes working on someone else, and now you go back to that person when the next crew arrives, we now have a child who has been VSA for 20 minutes. You're saying it's okay not just to transport them, which is what the medical directive says, under the trauma directive.
No, you can't use the trauma TOR, the termination of resuscitation for trauma. It does not apply to people less than 16. So you can't patch for a TOR. I'm not going to run this cardiac arrest. I'm looking for a field pronouncement for this patient, because they simply don't. We don't do that for 16 or less than 16. So really, but the crux of the matter is the difficulty that people have had with going back after initially triaging away from that patient to now hook them up and start CPR and start working them. But it's because when we were in mass casualty triage initially, we looked at this VSA and said this person has no likelihood of survival, or very low likelihood of survival, but this critical over there that's gasping for breath and looks like they're about to rest has a potential for survival, so I'm going to go to that person. Now more resources arrive. You're no longer in the mass casualty triage situation. So now you do, although it sounds contradictory, you now go back because now you have resources. So you go back like you would any other call when you have the appropriate resources and hook up the VSA. You hook up the previously VSA child and you start working them. And you do as you normally would do by your protocol, which is basically CPR and transport if you have the resources. Or if they meet obvious death criteria, they're obviously dead. But that person is VSA, but not pronounced. And part of this is the gap between your MCI training, and that the training for MCI came out in 2000. And since that time, the trauma TOR has been developed, and it wasn't in place when the training materials for after the 2000 MCI came out. So really, you're limited in terms of your options. But you can't trauma TOR a 16-year-old because it's against the directive. So I think that's the crux of some of the confusion is now we initially ignored a VSA, but now we're going back and hooking them up 20 minutes later. So if they initially had low chance of survival, why are we doing it now? But it's because you're a mass casualty triage and you ignored the person that had the least likelihood of survival and went for the person that has the highest likelihood of survival. Now you have resources, you focus on the person that is sick, anyone that's sick, because you have all the resources. A good case, as we were talking about on the way up here, is what happens if you had all these 4 patients, but at the same time 4 crews arrived? If 4 crews all arrived at the same time, well, then you would all hook up the patients, all work them, all transport them. You would never have to do this triage. Well, it's the same thing now that more crews are here. Now when more crews are here, you have the right resources, you match them, and you run them as you normally would. Thanks for pointing out. Yeah, I don't trauma TOR the less than 16.
Great, Lori. We have a question from the audience.
You can ask us. We can repeat it.
Okay. Question would be is you're talking about more resources arriving on scene. What happens if you have a fire department arrives on scene and they have a defibrillator, 1 or 2 defibrillators on their trucks or whatever? Do you get them to hook up to a VSA patient at that point in time? Say there was no extrication, patients were out at that point in time. Would they hook their defibrillators up to those VSA patients and work them?
Sure. So the question for those that can't hear it across the webinar is all of a sudden fire arrives and they have, let's say, two firefighters arrive with, or 2 separate crews from fire arrive with 2 separate AEDs.
Yeah.
And can they hook up these patients and assess them? And in theory, there is still EMS on scene because 1 crew is left, you still have a triage officer, 1 crew that remains triaging the patients. And my answer would be yes. I think you now have resources that can hook up and connect. And at this point, yeah, you have a paramedic that is able to assess the patients with that new resource, that new tool. You hook up, and then if, assuming they meet the criteria for trauma TOR, now you have an AED, you have a paramedic, and then you can call in for trauma TOR if they meet the criteria for it. Remember, trauma TOR, though, is still a question you're asking the doc, the BHP. You may not get the trauma TOR. So then all of a sudden they may say no transport, at which point you may be in a non-transport situation if you only have fire. So then that's where you have to tell the doc, well, I can't exactly bring them because I got fire here. So that's the other sort of situation which may arrive. Most BHPs in the setting of asystolic trauma patients realize that the mortality from blunt trauma is about 0%. So if you're asystolic and it's blood trauma, it's over. So most people feel quite comfortable pronouncing that. Not happy pronouncing it, just comfortable pronouncing it.
Mike Dunn, I've got a flood of typed questions coming in, and I'm going to kind of compile them all, and it's all about the peds. And it's all about the peds, and Don's smiling and nodding his head over there. And if everybody remembers back to, what was it, 2000, when we did the MCI course, and one thing that we threw into one of the scenarios was the VSA baby. Remember how difficult a time everybody had putting a blue sticker on that baby. But can you just go back over that whole, they're under the age of 16, but their VSA triage principles, say black or blue tag, whichever we happen to be using at the time. But once you get the resources there, and maybe it's been 15, 20, 25 minutes or whatever, that patient under the age of 16 has been VSA that long, you can't get a tour. So can you just, once again, just to help clarify, because I've got a number of questions on that, should they be calling for a patch? Should they be transporting? In some cases, even when they're under 16, if they're VSA, should they get priority as far as being transported earlier into the system?
Yeah, so I mean, that is the debate. And so, as I mentioned before, so if you have a pediatric, and as Dave knows me well, and most people know me well, that I'm not very fond of the what ifs. There's so many possible what ifs, and you wind up getting cornered in conversations about this. But the peds trauma, if you have a ton of peds, a bunch of kids there, you cannot use your trauma guideline. You can't use your trauma tour per se because it's very specific. You must be over 16 to use the trauma tour. So you have three options. You can CPR and transport. Now you have appropriate resources. You go to the VSAs and you work them and you bring them. They meet obvious death criteria as for BLS, which is very specific. Or in that situation, let's use the what if a bit further. You have 6 VSAs and they're all lying out there. Clearly, this is a very unusual circumstance. You're going to have this, and it's not unreasonable at that point to say, although the directive I can't call, there's no reason you can't patch at this point and say to your BHP, look, I got one paramedic crew, there are 6 pediatric VSAs here, I realize they don't meet the criteria for trauma tour, but it's an unusual circumstance. I can't pronounce or transport each one of these cases. I need some advice here. This one's asystolic, but doesn't meet obvious death. Can I pronounce this patient? Yes, it's under the unusual circumstance, and that's a question you're going to ask your BHP. So those are your 3 options in front of you. But when we use the medical directives, the medical directives are quite specific. You can't say, I'm going to use this medical directive called the trauma tour to pronounce this person. Well, it applies to greater than 16. But the number of days you're going to have a whole bunch of strewn pediatric VSAs thrown around the ground, it's going to be an unusual day when that happens. And I think that's a reasonable, unusual pronouncement, an unusual fact.
Yeah, and I think just so that I have it clear, I think what we're saying, what we are saying is that if you have one pediatric VSA, as soon as you get somebody there that can transport them, they should be transported. If there's a series of them and you have to start making a choice, that's an unusual circumstance. Okay? I don't know if that's clear.
Yeah, we're talking about multiple mass casualty.
Yes.
Yeah.
Not just one doesn't necessarily make an unusual circumstance.
No, I mean that's covered under the pediatric cardiac arrest algorithm. You have one via pediatric VSA. Which we spent quite a bit of time in research time talking about, I believe, Dave.
Okay, I hope that we caught up on all those. And in fact, one person who put that question in wrote back and said, gotcha, proper use of judgment and situation independent. So, yeah, it is very complex, as Mike and Don are trying to make that aware. And that's really one of the reasons why we had this webinar today, because there's been that shift since the last time we had an MCI course back in 2000 to all this new stuff with the tours that are available and everything else that's changed in our system. So that was one of the driving forces to this webinar today. Any other questions? I'm still looking for anybody to put their hand up, whether on the webinar, whether in the classroom.
Dave, we see a call here that says, was orange available or considered? We were there on the call. It sounded like there's bad weather. Was orange thought about or considered, or was it weathered out? Or?
I think it was weathered out.
Sounds like
it was storm pretty bad, thunderstorms and heavy rain.
So heavy rains and thunderstorms, it sounds like they were considered but not able to attend.
Oh, and sorry, Mike, just before I forget, one of the questions that came in, and I asked the medic to ask it, but apparently his microphone isn't working or he hasn't got one. Can you just touch briefly, and this is still in the idea of MCI, but broadening a little bit, about the use of ALS versus BLS procedures only when you're in that mass casualty situation?
Well, I think it depends. It's very dependent upon the situation, and again, if it means that you're going to have an extended period of time where you're going to be using your ALS procedures, and there's other people that might benefit from even basic procedures, then the theory behind it says that you should be benefiting the greatest number with the resources you have. So what you don't want to do is you don't want to be tied up doing intubations and things like this when there are other people who may not need the same interventions but do need something done. Okay, and again, I just want to make it clear, you don't have to stop doing that if you have nothing but green tags or walking wounded, because those people don't really need the care right now. It's only you're making these decisions between the critical ones. Okay, so like, for example, continuing to do CPR on somebody who's VSA is not likely going to benefit those people. If there's someone else who would need, say, for example, they are not responsive from a head injury and could be potentially blocking their airway, those are the people you invest your resources in. Okay, so I think, you know, that this is a very difficult. These cases are really very difficult. They require a lot of judgment, and they require the ability to sort of change tracks as things change. And it's always easy in retrospect to look at how a case was done and managed and be critical of it. And I think we all recognize that, and I think we also have to realize that the paramedics who are on scene at the time are doing their best, they're making their best judgments, and basically, unless there's something that's really out of whack, we're more than willing to support the judgments that were made at the time. We can talk about them, we can discuss them, but it's not easy being in these things, and it's very easy to use what's called a retrospectoscope, where you can look carefully at what happened and say this should have been done or that should have been done at the time, because these things are unusual and they're not something you face every day in your practice as paramedics. So anyway, I would like to thank everyone who joined us today live, either online or in the audience here. I'd like to thank the group from London who came up to support us in the rounds, and I'd also like to thank Gray EMS for sponsoring it for us.
At this point, there's no further questions. We can close the webinar, and thank everyone for coming.
Okay, well, still got questions being typed in, but I'm letting everybody know as my fingers are cramping here trying to keep up with it all. We'll continue on with this. Maybe afterwards we'll send in any email questions to us or anything else. We do track these questions, so maybe we'll be able to answer some of them afterwards as well. But I do want to thank Don and Tracy for pulling this together, for Wendy for hosting here in On Sound, all the paramedics who showed up today live, as well as there was 38 who had actually registered, as well as all the organizers and panelists, and especially to Tracy and Don and Mike for chiming in today. So if there are further questions, you can email us afterwards. We'll try to catch up on all that, but we'll shut off for now because we're almost at the 1 hour mark. And this will be recorded, or it has been recorded. It'll be posted on our website by tomorrow, so if anybody wants to play it back and get some of these points again. So again, thanks to everybody for the webinar, and we'll see you on February 9th. For Dr. Mike Peddle and sports injuries. Thanks, everyone.